ASI Weekly Global Insights, Asylum in Black and White, Selective Solidarity in US, UK, and European Immigration. In recent months, heightened racial tensions and immigration conflicts have surfaced across Western nations, revealing some troubling patterns in how Western governments respond to different migrant groups. The ASI Global Weekly Insights analysis examines three interconnected developments: the Trump administration's singular focus on protecting white South African Afrikaners, the United Kingdom's widespread anti-immigration protests targeting primarily non-white asylum seekers, and Europe's contradictory treatment of Ukrainian refugees versus migrants from Africa and the Middle East. This comprehensive assessment investigates whether these parallel developments reveal coordinated racial preferences in Western immigration policies or, more complex geopolitical realities, while proposing constructive solutions toward more equitable approaches. The timing of these developments coincides with rising far-right influence across Western democracies and upcoming electoral contests that have placed immigration at the center of political discourse. This analysis separates documented facts from rhetorical claims, examines the economic and historical context underlying these tensions, and proposes a framework for addressing discrimination while acknowledging legitimate policy challenges. The Trump administration's recent policy shift toward South Africa represents a dramatic intervention in African affairs based on specific racial demographics. On February 7, 2025, President Trump issued an executive order explicitly addressing what it termed government-sponsored race-based discrimination against ethnic minority Afrikaners in South Africa. The executive order frames South Africa's Expropriation Act 13 of 2024 as a primary catalyst, legislation that enables the South African government to seize ethnic minority Afrikaners' agricultural property without compensation. The order characterizes this as part of broader policies designed to dismantle equal opportunity in employment, education, and business alongside hateful rhetoric and government actions, fueling disproportionate violence against racially disfavored landowners. The order mandates that all executive departments and agencies shall halt foreign aid or assistance delivered or provided to South Africa while promoting the resettlement of Afrikaner refugees escaping government-sponsored race-based discrimination. The administration additionally justified this stance by citing South Africa's aggressive positions towards the United States and its allies, specifically referencing South Africa accusing Israel, rather than Hamas, of genocide in the International Court of Justice, and reinvigorating its relations with Iran to develop commercial, military, and nuclear arrangements. This diplomatic confrontation escalated further in September 2025 when the United States State Department moved South Africa to a Tier 2 watch list on human trafficking, citing insufficient efforts despite some progress. This development occurred amid what Reuters described as heightened tensions between their governments and the Trump administration. The key elements of Trump's South Africa executive order include several specific provisions. First, there is an aid suspension, which directs United States agencies to exercise their authorities to halt foreign assistance to South Africa. Second, the order calls for refugee prioritization, instructing the state and homeland security departments to create an admission plan that prioritizes Afrikaner resettlement. Third, the geopolitical rationale is clearly stated, citing South Africa's positions against United States interests, including its International Court of Justice case against Israel and its renewed relations with Iran. Finally, the human rights justification centers on protection against property confiscation, with explicit reference to Expropriation Act 13 of 2024. The administration's singular focus on protecting white South Africans has raised questions about selective humanitarianism, especially given the absence of comparable policies addressing conflicts affecting black populations across Africa. The explicit prioritization of a white minority group for United States refugee protection marks a significant departure from traditional humanitarian programs that typically prioritize vulnerability without racial filters. This policy has further strained United States-South Africa relations and potentially undermined United States influence across the African continent at a time when, multiple global powers are competing for partnerships and resources. The coincidence of this policy with South Africa's independent foreign policy stances that challenge United States interests raises legitimate questions about whether humanitarian concerns or geopolitical retaliation drives the administration's approach. So, the United Kingdom has experienced widespread anti-immigration protests throughout 2025, with significant episodes of violence and disorder focused primarily on accommodations housing non-white asylum seekers. These demonstrations, organized predominantly by far-right groups, have targeted asylum seekers from Africa, the Middle East, and other predominantly non-European regions, while Ukrainian refugees have received a notably different reception. The protest drivers and key actors really stand out here. The 2025 protests represent an escalation of far-right mobilization around asylum accommodation, building on previous disturbances, but with, significantly broader coordination and participation. Now, when it comes to triggering incidents, the protests gained nationwide momentum after a series of sexual assaults in Epping in July 2025, allegedly committed by an Ethiopian asylum seeker, though many subsequent protests actually occurred in locations with no similar triggering events at all. In terms of organizational infrastructure, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue documented Telegram's role as, quote, a safe space for extremists to coordinate activity and instigate violence. Facebook groups following the pattern X community says no to Y local hotel served as additional organizational platforms, and many of these were administered by members of far-right groups like the Homeland Party. On the political front, more mainstream political figures have amplified these sentiments, with Reform UK MPs like Lee Anderson posting videos outside asylum hotels expressing outrage about their use for asylum seekers. UKIP has even organised a mass deportations tour, marching in multiple cities including Glasgow, Nottingham, Liverpool, Newcastle, and London. The UK government's approach to Ukrainian refugees versus other asylum seekers has been notably different, lending credence to claims of racial disparity. Ukrainians fleeing conflict have benefited from structured resettlement programs, work rights, and access to services without being concentrated in the controversial asylum hotels that have become protest flashpoints. In contrast, non-white asylum seekers are typically housed in what were originally temporary contingency hotels that have become long-term accommodations, with residents receiving just £49.18 per week to cover all living costs and prohibited from working while their claims are processed. Inspection reports have documented hotels with honestly poor record-keeping, inadequate security and facilities, lacking basic amenities such as cooking areas and outside space for children. The concentration of large numbers of asylum seekers in these former hotels has created tensions in local communities, with local residents rarely being informed of the use of a hotel in advance, creating a damaging sense of community powerlessness. The disparity between the welcome extended to Ukrainian refugees, who are predominantly white, and the hostility directed toward asylum seekers from Africa and the Middle East has fueled accusations of systemic racism in UK immigration policy, though government officials cite legal pathways versus irregular migration as the distinguishing factor. The European Union faces a fundamental contradiction. Even though Europeans tend to overestimate the number of migrants in their societies, believing that 16% of their population are non-EU citizens, when in reality the figure is actually less than 7%. There is a growing need for migrant workers to address critical labor shortages. Yet, political resistance to non-white migration continues to rise. When we look at the facts, comprehensive data shows that migrants, including those from outside the EU, actually provide net positive economic benefits to host countries, which, really runs counter to a lot of populist narratives. For example, the European Commission has identified 42 occupations facing worker shortages across the EU, including sectors like construction, transport, agriculture, hospitality, and health and social care. According to the 2024 Labour Shortages Report, many of these sectors are essential for the good functioning and competitiveness of the European economy. Looking at the fiscal impact, a 2024 study by economists from Leiden University found that in the majority, 8 out of 15 EU countries examined, third-country national migrants from outside the EU are actually less costly for the government than native citizens. In countries such as Belgium, Greece, Italy, Luxembourg, and Portugal, migrants contribute more to the national budget than they take out. And, just to give a concrete example, the positive economic impact is further demonstrated by Ukrainian refugees in countries like Poland. A UNHCR and Deloitte study found that the presence of refugees from Ukraine generated 2.7% of Poland's gross domestic product, with their contribution vastly outstripping the cost of any support they received. Integration is really the critical factor here. The European experience shows that successful integration is what actually determines public acceptance of migration. According to Eurobarometer surveys, 70% of Europeans agree that both newcomers and host communities must share responsibility for successful integration, and learning the local language is seen as the most important factor. The difference in integration support between Ukrainian refugees and other migrant groups may partly explain the different outcomes and public perceptions. Ukrainians have benefited from coordinated integration programs, while other migrants often face administrative barriers and limited support, which can unfortunately create self-reinforcing cycles of exclusion and marginalization. It's important to recognize that the migration tensions we see today can't really be understood without considering the historical context of colonial exploitation and the ongoing extraction of resources that continues to shape global economic inequalities. When we look at colonial legacies, contemporary migration patterns often follow routes established during colonial periods, with former colonial subjects seeking opportunities in former colonial powers. Yet despite these historical ties and obligations, they often face resistance. The point about natural resources from Africa, the Middle East and Asia supporting Western economies is backed by extensive economic research. The extraction of valuable resources from these regions, often with limited benefit to local populations, creates enduring economic dependencies and development challenges that, in turn, fuel migration pressures. Even though it hasn't been explicitly mentioned in the search results, climate change disproportionately affecting regions with limited historical responsibility for emissions is now an emerging driver of migration that intersects with these historical inequities. Now, this historical understanding doesn't take away from the legitimate challenges that host communities face in integrating new arrivals, but it does provide essential context for making sense of the broader structural forces shaping migration patterns today. So addressing the current crisis, really means moving beyond reactionary policies and instead focusing on evidence-based, equitable approaches. These approaches should recognize both historical responsibilities and the realities of today's political landscape. When we talk about solutions, policy and institutional reforms are absolutely crucial. For example, expanding regular pathways is key. The European Union acknowledges that most people entering the EU actually come through legal migration channels, like work, study, family reunification, or resettlement. And these legal pathways mainly help address EU labor market needs. By expanding these regular pathways, it could really reduce irregular migration and, at the same time, undermine smuggling networks. On the topic of anti-racism education, organizations such as the United Nations recommend educational initiatives that encourage people to check their assumptions and confront their biases and stereotypes. The UC Davis Office of the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion also suggests that departments participate in a 21-day anti-racism challenge and even initiate a diversity, equity and inclusion lecture and discussion series. When it comes to community engagement models, adopting the principles of community engagement is important. These principles emphasize going to the community, establishing relationships, building trust, and working with both formal and informal leadership before implementing any programs. Finally, local economic partnerships matter too. One effective approach is to work with the procurement office to increase local purchasing of goods from women and minority-owned businesses, making sure economic benefits are, more widely shared. Media responsibility and narrative correction. To combat the widespread misinformation, like the dramatic overestimation of migrant populations, it's crucial to promote accurate data. For instance, data from the European Commission shows that the actual share is less than 7% of the population being non-EU citizens, which is quite contrary to the public perception of 16%. Supporting initiatives like the UN's No to Hate campaign is also essential, as it aims to counter hate speech and safeguard human rights. International cooperation and responsibility sharing. The EU experience really shows that agreements and partnerships between the EU and African countries such as Tunisia, Egypt, or Mauritania have been quite effective in limiting irregular departures. Developing comprehensive approaches that address the drivers of migration is key. This can be done through ethical economic partnerships, climate adaptation support, and equitable trade terms that enable sustainable development in origin countries. Conclusion: toward equitable migration governance. The parallel developments in the United States, United Kingdom, and European Union reveal some disturbing patterns of racial disparity in immigration policies. though there's significant complexity behind these apparent double standards. The Trump administration's exclusive focus on white South Africans, the UK's contrasting reception of Ukrainian refugees versus other asylum seekers, and Europe's need for migrant labor alongside political resistance to non-white migration collectively suggest that racial perceptions continue to influence immigration approaches. Despite official claims of neutrality, the economic evidence is clear. Migrants from all regions provide net benefits to host societies when given adequate integration support. The example of Ukrainian refugees in Poland generating 2.7% of GDP demonstrates this potential, while studies confirming that third-country nationals are less costly for the government than native citizens in most EU countries debunk populist myths. Moving forward, evidence-based policies that expand regular migration pathways, combat racism through education and media responsibility, and address historical inequities through ethical economic partnerships offer the most promising approach. These solutions acknowledge both the legitimate challenges of migration management and the moral imperative of equitable treatment, providing a path beyond the current political impasses. The future of Western societies will be shaped by their ability to transcend historical racial hierarchies and build inclusive communities that recognize our shared humanity while practically addressing the complex challenges of migration in an interconnected world. This analysis was prepared for ASI Global Weekly Insights based on current reporting and official documentation. This is Africa Social Intellect, your premier destination for thought-provoking discussions and insightful perspectives on the vibrant and diverse African community and beyond. Our dedication extends beyond conversations. In recognizing the importance of security, we provide essential information to help safeguard vulnerable nations. From navigating local challenges to assisting these vulnerable nations against imperialistic threats, we stand as a beacon of awareness and resilience. If you're on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and share our news. If you're watching on Facebook or another platform, follow us and share this reliable news source. We hope you enjoy the news, and thank you for watching, and see you next time.